History of the United States 1789 to 1815, the new government 1789 to 1797. George Washington's presidency 1789. George Washington unanimously elected as the first president of the United States. John Adams became vice president. Presidential election of 1789. Following the first presidential election in 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected president of the United States. With 69 electoral votes, Washington won the support from each participating state. No other president since has come into office with a universal mandate to lead, electing the president between December 15, 1788 and January 10, 1789. The presidential electors were chosen in each of the states. Washington described these electors as having characters of the gentleman. On February 4, 1789, the Electoral College convened. 10 states cast electoral votes: Connecticut, Delaware, Georgia, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, and Virginia. New York, however, failed to field a slate of electors. North Carolina and Rhode Island were unable to participate because they had not yet ratified the Constitution. After a quorum was finally established, the Congress counted and certified the electoral vote count on April 6. To many, Washington was an obvious first choice for president. As president of the Constitutional Convention, many delegates framed the role of the executive branch around his leadership. He was both a national hero and the favorite son of Virginia, the largest state at the time. Washington ascended to the presidency with practical experience, having served as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army during the American Revolution, according to Article 2 of the Constitution. Each elector in the Electoral College possessed 2 votes. The candidate who received a majority of the votes was elected president. The candidate with the second most votes in the Electoral College, whether a majority or a plurality, was elected vice president. Behind Washington, John Adams, who most recently had served as the first U.S. ambassador to Great Britain, finished with 30 electoral votes and became the first vice president of the United States. Being from Massachusetts, Adams' election provided the administration a regional balance between the South and North. Other candidates receiving multiple electoral votes were John J. 9, Robert Harrison 6, John Rutledge 6, John Hancock 4, and George Clinton 3. 5 candidates split the remaining 7 votes. Upon hearing the news of his decisive election, Washington set out from Mount Vernon to take his place in presidential history, the first presidential inauguration April 30, 1789. At Federal Hall in New York City, the first capital of the United States, Washington took the presidential oath of office. Though filled with great anxiety, Washington shared in his first inaugural address that he was assuming the role in obedience to the public summons, and he explained that the voice of my country called me to with a hand on the Bible, a sacred volume borrowed from a local Masonic lodge and subsequently known as the George Washington Inaugural Bible. He swore his oath as the first president of the United States. Constitution goes into effect. Bill of Rights introduced, ratified in 1791. United States Bill of Rights. The United States Bill of Rights comprises the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. It was proposed following the often bitter 1787-88 debate over the ratification of the Constitution and written to address the objections raised by anti-federalists. The amendments of the Bill of Rights add to the Constitution specific guarantees of personal freedoms, such as freedom of speech, the right to publish, practice religion, possess firearms, to assemble, and other natural and legal rights. Its clear limitations on the government's power in judicial and other proceedings include explicit declarations that all powers not specifically granted to the federal government by the Constitution are reserved to the states or the people. The concepts codified in these amendments are built upon those in earlier documents, especially the Virginia Declaration of Rights 1776, as well as the Northwest Ordinance 1787. The English Bill of Rights 1689, and Magna Carta 1215, largely because of the efforts of Representative James Madison, who studied the deficiencies of the Constitution pointed out by Anti-Federalists and then crafted a series of corrective proposals. Congress approved 12 articles of amendment on September 25, 1789, and submitted them to the states for ratification. Contrary to Madison's proposal that the proposed amendments be incorporated into the main body of the Constitution at the relevant articles and sections of the document, they were proposed as supplemental additions codicils to it. Articles 3 through 12 were ratified as additions to the Constitution on December 15, 1791, and became Amendments 1 through 10 of the Constitution. Article 2 became part of the Constitution on May 5, 1992, as the 27th Amendment. Article 1 is still pending before the states, although Madison's proposed amendments included a provision to extend the protection of some of the Bill of Rights to the states. The amendments that were finally submitted for ratification applied only to the federal government. The door for their application upon state governments was opened in the 1860s, following ratification of the 14th Amendment. Since the early 20th century, both federal and state courts have used the 14th Amendment to apply portions of the Bill of Rights to state and local governments. The process is known as incorporation. James Madison initially opposed the idea of creating a Bill of Rights, primarily for two reasons. The Constitution did not grant the federal government the power to take away people's rights. The federal government's powers are few and defined listed in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Any powers not listed in the Constitution reside with the states or the people themselves. By creating a list of people's rights, then anything not on the list was therefore not protected. Madison and the other framers believed that we have natural rights and they are too numerous to list. So, writing a list would be counterproductive. However, opponents of the ratification of the Constitution objected that it contained no Bill of Rights. So, in order to secure ratification, Madison agreed to support adding a Bill of Rights and even served as its author. He resolved the dilemma mentioned in Item 2 above by including the 9th Amendment, which states that just because a right has not been listed in the Bill of Rights does not mean that it does not exist. There are several original engrossed copies of the Bill of Rights still in existence. One of these is on permanent public display at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Philadelphia Convention prior to the ratification and implementation of the United States Constitution. The 13 sovereign states follow the Articles of Confederation, created by the Second Continental Congress and ratified in 1781. However, the national government that operated under the Articles of Confederation was too weak to adequately regulate the various conflicts that arose between the states. The Philadelphia Convention set out to correct weaknesses of the Articles that had been apparent even before the American Revolutionary War had been successfully concluded. The convention took place from May 14 to September 17, 1787 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Although the convention was purportedly intended only to revise the Articles, the intention of many of its proponents, chief among them James Madison of Virginia and Alexander Hamilton of New York, was to create a new government rather than fix the existing one. The convention convened in the Pennsylvania State House, and George Washington of Virginia was unanimously elected as president of the convention. The 55 delegates who drafted the Constitution are among the men known as the founding fathers of the new nation. Thomas Jefferson, who was minister to France during the convention, characterized the delegates as an assembly of demigods. Rhode Island refused to send delegates to the convention on September 12. George Mason of Virginia suggested the addition of a Bill of Rights to the Constitution modeled on previous state declarations, and Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts made it a formal motion. However, after only a brief discussion where Roger Sherman pointed out that state bills of rights were not repealed by the new Constitution, the motion was defeated by a unanimous vote of the state delegations. Madison, then an opponent of a Bill of Rights, later explained the vote by calling the state bills of rights parchment barriers that offered only an illusion of protection against tyranny. Another delegate, James Wilson of Pennsylvania, later argued that the act of enumerating the rights of the people would have been dangerous, because it would imply that rights not explicitly mentioned did not exist. Hamilton echoed this point in Federalisteques. Mason and Gerry had emerged as opponents of the proposed new Constitution. Their motion, introduced 5 days before the end of the convention, may also have been seen by other delegates as a delaying tactic. The quick rejection of this motion, however, later endangered the entire ratification process. Author David O. Stewart characterizes the omission of a Bill of Rights in the original Constitution as a political blunder of the first magnitude, while historian Jack Enrichov calls it the one serious miscalculation the framers made as they looked ahead to the struggle over ratification. 39 delegates signed the finalized Constitution. 13 delegates left before it was completed, and 3 who remained at the convention until the end refused to sign it: Mason, Gerry, and Edmund Randolph of Virginia. Afterward, the Constitution was presented to the Articles of Confederation Congress with a request that it afterwards be submitted to a convention of delegates, chosen in each state by the people, for their assent and ratification. Anti-Federalists following the Philadelphia Convention, some leading revolutionary figures such as Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, and Richard Henry Lee, publicly opposed the new frame of government, a position known as anti-federalism. Elbridge Gerry wrote the most popular anti-federalist tract, Hun, Mr. Gerry's Objections, which went through 46 printings. The essay particularly focused on the lack of a Bill of Rights. In the proposed Constitution, many were concerned that a strong national government was a threat to individual rights, and that the president would become a king. Jefferson wrote to Madison advocating a Bill of Rights, "Half a loaf is better than no bread. If we cannot secure all our rights, let us secure what we can." The pseudonymous anti-federalist Brutus, probably Robert Yates, wrote, "We find they have, in the 9th section of the first article, declared that the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended, unless in cases of rebellion, that no bill of attainder or ex post facto law shall be passed, that no title of nobility shall be granted by the United States, etc., if everything which is not given is reserved." What propriety is there in these exceptions? Does this Constitution anywhere grant the power of suspending the habeas corpus, to make ex post facto laws, pass bills of attainder, or grant titles of nobility? It certainly does not in express terms. The only answer that can be given is that these are implied in the general powers granted. With equal truth it may be said that all the powers which the Bills of Rights guard against the abuse of are contained or implied in the general ones granted by this Constitution. He continued with this observation: ought not a government, vested with such extensive and indefinite authority, to have been restricted by a Declaration of Rights? It certainly ought. So clear a point is this that I cannot help suspecting that persons who attempt to persuade people that such reservations were less necessary under this Constitution than under those of the states are willfully endeavoring to deceive and to lead you into an absolute state of vassalage. Federalist suppers of the Constitution, known as Federalists, opposed a Bill of Rights for much of the ratification period, in part because of the procedural uncertainties it would create. Madison argued against such an inclusion, suggesting that state governments were sufficient guarantors of personal liberty. In No. 46 of the Federalist Papers, a series of essays promoting the Federalist position, Hamilton opposed a Bill of Rights in the Federalist No. 84, stating that the Constitution is itself in every rational sense and every useful purpose a Bill of Rights. He stated that ratification did not mean the American people were surrendering their rights, making protections unnecessary. Here, in strictness, the people surrender nothing, and as they retain everything, they have no need of particular reservations. Patrick Henry criticized the Federalist point of view, writing that the legislature must be firmly informed of the extent of the rights retained by the people Being in a state of uncertainty, they will assume rather than give up powers by implication. Other anti-federalists pointed out that earlier political documents, in particular Magna Carta, had protected specific rights. In response, Hamilton argued that the Constitution was inherently different. Bills of Rights are in their origin stipulations between kings and their subjects, abridgments of prerogative in favor of privilege, reservations of rights not surrendered to the prince. Such was the Magna Carta, obtained by the barons, swords in hand, from King John. Massachusetts Compromise in December 1787 and January 1788. 5 states, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, and Connecticut, ratified the Constitution with relative ease, though the bitter minority report of the Pennsylvania opposition was widely circulated. In contrast to its predecessors, the Massachusetts Convention was angry and contentious, at one point erupting into a fist fight between Federalist Delegate Francis Dana and Anti-Federalist Elbridge Gerry. When the latter was not allowed to speak, the impasse was resolved only when revolutionary heroes and leading anti-federalists Samuel Adams and John Hancock agreed to ratification, on the condition that the convention also propose amendments. The convention's proposed amendments included a requirement for grand jury indictment in capital cases, which would form part of the Fifth Amendment, and an amendment reserving powers to the states not expressly given to the federal government, which would later form the basis for the 10th Amendment, following Massachusetts' lead. The Federalist minorities in both Virginia and New York were able to obtain ratification in convention by linking ratification to recommended amendments. A committee of the Virginia Convention headed by law professor George Wythe forwarded 40 recommended amendments to Congress, 20 of which enumerated individual rights and another 20 of which enumerated states' rights. The latter amendments included limitations on federal powers to levy taxes and regulate trade. A minority of the Constitution's critics, such as Maryland's Luther Martin, continued to oppose ratification. However, Martin's allies, such as New York's John Lansing Jr., dropped moves to obstruct the convention's process. They began to take exception to the Constitution as it was, seeking amendments. Several conventions saw supporters for amendments before shift to a position of amendments after for the sake of staying in the Union. Ultimately, only North Carolina and Rhode Island waited for amendments from Congress before ratifying. Article 7 of the proposed Constitution set the terms by which the new frame of government would be established. The new Constitution would become operational when ratified by at least 9 states. Only then would it replace the existing government under the Articles of Confederation and would apply only to those states that ratified it. Following contentious battles in several states, the proposed Constitution reached that 9-state ratification plateau in June 1788. On September 13, 1788, the Articles of Confederation, Congress certified that the new Constitution had been ratified by more than enough states for the new system to be implemented and directed the new government to meet in New York City on the first Wednesday in March the following year. On March 4, 1789, the new frame of government came into force with 11 of the 13 states participating. New York's circular letter in New York. The majority of the ratifying convention was anti-federalist and they were not inclined to follow the Massachusetts Compromise. Led by Mellington Smith, they were inclined to make the ratification of New York conditional on prior proposal of amendments or perhaps insist on the right to secede from the Union if amendments are not promptly proposed. Hamilton, after consulting with Madison, informed the convention that this would not be accepted by Congress after ratification by the 9th state. New Hampshire followed shortly by Virginia. It was clear the Constitution would go into effect with or without New York as a member of the Union in a compromise. The New York Convention proposed to ratify, feeling confident that the states would call for new amendments using the convention procedure in Article 5. Rather than making this a condition of ratification by New York, John Jay wrote the New York circular letter calling for the use of this procedure, which was then sent to all the states. The legislatures in New York and Virginia passed resolutions calling for the convention to propose amendments that had been demanded by the states, while several other states tabled the matter to consider in a future legislative session. Madison wrote the Bill of Rights partially in response to this action from the states. Proposal and ratification, anticipating amendments. The first United States Congress, which met in New York City's Federal Hall, was a triumph for the Federalists. The Senate of 11 states contained 20 Federalists with only 2 Anti-Federalists, both from Virginia. The House included 48 Federalists to 11 Anti-Federalists, the latter of whom were from only 4 states: Massachusetts, New York, Virginia, and South Carolina. Among the Virginia delegation to the House was James Madison, Patrick Henry's chief opponent in the Virginia ratification battle. In retaliation for Madison's victory in that battle at Virginia's ratification convention, Henry and other Anti-Federalists, who controlled the Virginia House of Delegates, had gerrymandered a hostile district for Madison's planned congressional run and recruited Madison's future presidential successor, James Monroe, to oppose him. Madison defeated Monroe after offering a campaign pledge that he would introduce constitutional amendments, forming a Bill of Rights at the first Congress, originally opposed to the inclusion of a Bill of Rights in the Constitution. Madison had gradually come to understand the importance of doing so during the often contentious ratification debates. By taking the initiative to propose amendments himself through the Congress, he hoped to preempt a second constitutional convention that might, it was feared, undo the difficult compromises of 1787 and open the entire Constitution to reconsideration, thus risking the dissolution of the new federal government. Writing to Jefferson, he stated, "The friends of the Constitution, some from an approbation of particular amendments, others from a spirit of conciliation, are generally agreed that the system should be revised, but they wish the revisal to be carried no farther than to supply additional guards for liberty." He also felt that amendments guaranteeing personal liberties would give to the government its due popularity and stability. Finally, he hoped that the amendments would acquire by degrees the character of fundamental maxims of free government, and as they become incorporated with the national sentiment, counteract the impulses of interest and passion. Historians continue to debate the degree to which Madison considered the amendments of the Bill of Rights necessary, and to what degree he considered them politically expedient. In the outline of his address, he wrote, "Bill of Rights useful, not essential." On the occasion of his April 30, 1789 inauguration as the nation's first president, George Washington addressed the subject of amending the Constitution. He urged the legislators, "Whilst you carefully avoid every alteration which might endanger the benefits of an united and effective government, or which ought to await the future lessons of experience, a reverence for the characteristic rights of freemen and a regard for public harmony will sufficiently influence your deliberations on the question how far the former can be impregnably fortified, or the latter be safely and advantageously promoted." Madison's proposed amendments. Madison introduced a series of constitutional amendments in the House of Representatives for consideration. Among his proposals was one that would have added introductory language stressing natural rights to the preamble. Another would apply parts of the Bill of Rights to the states as well as the federal government. Several sought to protect individual personal rights by limiting various constitutional powers of Congress, like Washington. Madison urged Congress to keep the revision to the Constitution a moderate one, limited to protecting individual rights. Madison was deeply read in the history of government and used a range of sources in composing the amendments. The English Magna Carta of 1215 inspired the right to petition and to trial by jury. For example, while the English Bill of Rights of 1689 provided an early precedent for the right to keep and bear arms, although this applied only to Protestants and prohibited cruel and unusual punishment, the Greatest influence on Madison's text, however, was existing state constitutions. Many of his amendments, including his proposed new preamble, were based on the Virginia Declaration of Rights drafted by Anti-Federalist George Mason in 1776 to reduce future opposition to ratification. Madison also looked for recommendations shared by many states. He did provide one, however, that no state had requested. No state shall violate the equal rights of conscience or the freedom of the press, or the trial by jury in criminal cases. He did not include an amendment that every state had asked for, one that would have made tax assessments voluntary instead of contributions. Madison proposed the following constitutional amendments. First, that there be prefixed to the Constitution a declaration that all power is originally vested in and consequently derived from the people, that government is instituted and ought to be exercised for the benefit of the people, which consists in the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the right of acquiring and using property, and generally of pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety, that the people have an indubitable, unalienable, and indefeasible right to reform or change their government, whenever it be found adverse or inadequate to the purposes of its institution. Secondly, that in Article 1st, Section 2, Clause 3, these words be struck out, to wit, the number of representatives shall not exceed 1 for every 30,000, but each state shall have at least 1 representative, and until such enumeration shall be made, and in place thereof be inserted these words, to wit, after the first actual enumeration, there shall be 1 representative for every 30,000 until the number amounts to, after which the proportion shall be so regulated by Congress, that the number shall never be less than, nor more than, but each state shall, after the first enumeration, have at least 2 representatives, and prior thereto. Thirdly, that in Article 1st, Section 6, Clause 1, there be added to the end of the first sentence these words, to wit, but no law varying the compensation last ascertained shall operate before the next ensuing election of representatives. Fourthly, that in Article 1st, Section 9, between Clauses 3 and 4 be inserted these clauses, to wit, the civil rights of none shall be abridged on account of religious belief or worship, nor shall any national religion be established, nor shall the full and equal rights of conscience be in any manner or on any pretext infringed. The people shall not be deprived or abridged of their right to speak, to write, or to publish their sentiments, and the freedom of the press, as one of the great bulwarks of liberty, shall be inviolable. The people shall not be restrained from peaceably assembling and consulting for their common good, nor from applying to the legislature by petitions or remonstrances for redress of their grievances. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, a well-armed and well-regulated militia being the best security of a free country. But no person religiously scrupulous of bearing arms shall be compelled to render military service in person. No soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor at any time, but in a manner warranted by law. No person shall be subject, except in cases of impeachment, to more than 1 punishment or 1 trial for the same offense, nor shall be compelled to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor be obliged to relinquish his property where it may be necessary for public use, without a just compensation. Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. The rights of the people to be secured in their persons, their houses, their papers, and their other property, from all unreasonable searches and seizures, shall not be violated by warrants issued without probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, or not particularly describing the places to be searched, or the persons or things to be seized. In all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial, to be informed of the cause and nature of the accusation, to be confronted with his accusers and the witnesses against him, to have a compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his favor, and have the assistance of counsel for his defense, the exceptions here or elsewhere in the Constitution, made in favor of particular rights, shall not be so construed as to diminish the just importance of other rights retained by the people, or as to enlarge the powers delegated by the Constitution, but either as actual limitations of such powers, or as inserted merely for greater caution. Fiftly, that in Article 1st, Section 10, between clauses 1 and 2, be inserted this clause, to wit, no state shall violate the equal rights of conscience, or the freedom of the press, or the trial by jury in criminal cases.
Sixthly, that, in Article 3d, Section 2, be annexed to the end of Clause 2d, these words, to wit, but no appeal to such court shall be allowed where the value in controversy shall not amount to dollars, nor shall any fact triable by jury, according to the course of common law, be otherwise re-examinable than may consist with the principles of common law. Seventhly, that, in Article 3d, Section 2, the third clause be struck out, and in its place be inserted the clauses following, to wit, the trial of all crimes except in cases of impeachments, and cases arising in the land or naval forces, or the militia when on actual service, in time of war or public danger, shall be by an impartial jury of freeholders of the vicinage, with the requisite of unanimity for conviction, of the right with the requisite of unanimity for conviction, of the right of challenge, and other accustomed requisites, and in all crimes punishable with loss of life or member, presentment or indictment by a grand jury shall be an essential preliminary, provided that in cases of crimes committed within any county which may be in possession of an enemy, or in which a general insurrection may prevail, the trial may by law be authorized in some other county of the same state, as near as may be to the seat of the OFFENCE. In cases of crimes committed not within any county, the trial may by law be in such county as the laws shall have prescribed. In suits at common law, between man and man, the trial by jury, as one of the best securities to the rights of the people, ought to remain inviolate. Eighthly, that immediately after Article 6th, be inserted, as Article 7th, the clauses following, to wit, the powers delegated by this Constitution are appropriated to the departments to which they are respectively distributed, so that the legislative department shall never exercise the powers vested in the executive or judicial, nor the executive exercise the powers vested in the legislative or judicial, nor the judicial exercise the powers vested in the legislative or executive departments. The powers not delegated by this Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states, respectively. Ninthly, that Article 7th be numbered as Article 8th. Crafting amendments, Federalist representatives were quick to attack Madison's proposal, fearing that any move to amend the new Constitution so soon after its implementation would create an appearance of instability in the government. The House, unlike the Senate, was open to the public, and members such as Fisher Ames warned that a prolonged dissection of the Constitution before the galleries could shake public confidence, a procedural battle followed, and after initially forwarding the amendments to a select committee for revision, the House agreed to take Madison's proposal up as a full-body beginning. On July 21, 1789, the 11-member committee made some significant changes to Madison's 9 proposed amendments, including eliminating most of his preamble and adding the phrase freedom of speech and of the press. The House debated the amendments for 11 days. Roger Sherman of Connecticut persuaded the House to place the amendments at the Constitution's end so that the document would remain inviolate, rather than adding them throughout, as Madison had proposed. The amendments, revised and condensed from 20 to 17, were approved and forwarded to the Senate on August 24, 1789. The Senate edited these amendments still further, making 26 changes of its own. Madison's proposal to apply parts of the Bill of Rights to the states as well as the federal government was eliminated, and the 17 amendments were condensed to 12. Which were approved on September 9, 1789. The Senate also eliminated the last of Madison's proposed changes to the preamble. On September 21, 1789, a House-Senate Conference Committee convened to resolve the numerous differences between the two Bill of Rights proposals. On September 24, 1789, the committee issued this report, which finalized 12 constitutional amendments for House and Senate to consider. This final version was approved by joint resolution of Congress on September 25, 1789. To be forwarded by John J. Beckley to the states on September 28. By the time the debates and legislative maneuvering that went into crafting the Bill of Rights amendments was done, many personal opinions had shifted. A number of Federalists came out in support, thus silencing the Anti-Federalists' most effective critique. Many Anti-Federalists, in contrast, were now opposed, realizing that congressional approval of these amendments would greatly lessen the chances of a second constitutional convention. Anti-Federalists such as Richard Henry Lee also argued that the bill left the most objectionable portions of the Constitution, such as the federal judiciary and direct taxation, intact. Madison remained active in the progress of the amendments throughout the legislative process. Historian Gordon S. Wood writes that there is no question that it was Madison's personal prestige and his dogged persistence that saw the amendments through the Congress. There might have been a federal constitution without Madison, but certainly no Bill of Rights. Federal Judiciary Act 1789 *. One of the first acts of the new Congress was to establish a federal court system through the Judiciary Act signed by President Washington on September 24, 1789. Founders of the new nation believed that the establishment of a national judiciary was one of their most important tasks. Yet, Article 3 of the Constitution of the United States, the provision that deals with the judiciary branch of government, is markedly smaller than Articles I and II, which created the legislative and executive branches. The generality of Article 3 of the Constitution raised questions that Congress had to address. In the Judiciary Act of 1789, these questions had no easy answers, and the solutions to them were achieved politically. The first Congress decided that it could regulate the jurisdiction of all federal courts. And in the Judiciary Act of 1789, Congress established with great particularity a limited jurisdiction for the district and circuit courts, gave the Supreme Court the original jurisdiction provided for in the Constitution, and granted the court appellate jurisdiction in cases from the federal circuit courts and from the state courts where those courts' rulings had rejected federal claims. The decision to grant federal courts a jurisdiction more restrictive than that allowed by the Constitution represented a recognition by the Congress that the people of the United States would not find a full-blown federal court system palatable at that time. For nearly all of the next century, the judicial system remained essentially as established by the Judiciary Act of 1789, after the country had expanded across a continent and had been torn apart by civil war were major changes made. A separate tier of appellate circuit courts created in 1891 removed the burden of circuit riding from the shoulders of the Supreme Court justices, but otherwise left intact the judicial structure. With minor adjustments, it is the same system we have today. Congress has continued to build on the interpretation of the drafters of the first Judiciary Act in exercising a discretionary power to expand or restrict federal court jurisdiction. While opinions as to what constitutes the proper balance of federal and state concerns vary no less today than they did 2 centuries ago, the fact that today's federal court system closely resembles the one created in 1789 suggests that the first Congress performed its job admirably. Hamilton's Financial Plan, 1792-1791. Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of Treasury, proposed federal assumption of state debts. Meanwhile, during George Washington's presidency, political trouble was already brewing. Washington's cabinet choices reflected continuing tension between politicians who wanted and who feared a powerful national government. The vice president was John Adams, and Washington chose Alexander Hamilton to be his Secretary of the Treasury. Both men wanted an active government that would promote prosperity by supporting American industry. However, Washington chose Thomas Jefferson to be his Secretary of State, and Jefferson was committed to restricting federal power and preserving an economy based on agriculture. From almost the beginning, Washington struggled to reconcile the Federalist and Republican or Democratic Republican factions within his own administration. Alexander Hamilton believed that self-interest was the most powerful incentive of human actions. Self-interest drove humans to accumulate property, and that effort created commerce and industry. According to Hamilton, government had important roles to play in this process. First, the state should protect private property from theft. Second, according to Hamilton, the state should use human passions and make them subservient to the public good. In other words, a wise government would harness its citizens' desire for property, so that both private individuals and the state would benefit. Hamilton, like many of his contemporary statesmen, did not believe the state should ensure an equal distribution of property. Inequality was the great and fundamental distinction in society, and Hamilton saw no reason to change this reality. Instead, Hamilton wanted to tie the economic interests of wealthy Americans, or moneyed men, to the federal government's financial health. If the rich needed the government, then they would direct their energies to making sure it remained solvent. Hamilton, therefore, believed that the federal government must be a repository of the rights of the wealthy. As the nation's first Secretary of the Treasury, he proposed an ambitious financial plan to achieve that. The first part of Hamilton's plan involved federal assumption of state debts, which were mostly left over from the Revolutionary War. The federal government would assume responsibility for the state's unpaid debts, which totaled about $25 million. Second, Hamilton wanted Congress to create a Bank of the United States. The goal of these proposals was to link federal power and the country's economic vitality. Under the assumption proposal, The state's creditors, people who owned state bonds or promissory notes, would turn their old notes in to the treasury and receive new federal notes of the same face value. Hamilton foresaw that these bonds would circulate like money, acting as an engine of business, an instrument of industry and commerce. This part of his plan, however, was controversial for two reasons. First, many taxpayers objected to paying the full face value on old notes, which had fallen in market value. Often the current holders had purchased them from the original creditors for pennies on the dollar. To pay them at full face value, therefore, would mean rewarding speculators at taxpayer expense. Hamilton countered that government debts must be honored in full, or else citizens would lose all trust in the government. Second, many Southerners objected that they had already paid their outstanding state debts, so federal assumption would mean forcing them to pay again for the debts of New Englanders. Nevertheless, President Washington and Congress both accepted Hamilton's argument. By the end of 1794, 98% of the country's domestic debt had been converted into new federal bonds. Hamilton's plan for a Bank of the United States, similarly, won congressional approval. Despite strong opposition, Thomas Jefferson and other Republicans argued that the plan was unconstitutional. The Constitution did not authorize Congress to create a bank. Hamilton, however, argued that the bank was not only constitutional but also important for the country's prosperity. The Bank of the United States would fulfill several needs. It would act as a convenient depository for federal funds. It would print paper banknotes backed by specie gold or silver. Its agents would also help control inflation by periodically taking state banknotes to their banks of origin and demanding specie in exchange, limiting the amount of notes the state banks printed. Furthermore, it would give wealthy people a vested interest in the federal government's finances. The government would control just 20% of the bank's stock. The other 80% would be owned by private investors. Thus, an intimate connection between the government and wealthy men would benefit both. And this connection would promote American commerce. In 1791, therefore, Congress approved a 20-year charter for the Bank of the United States. The bank's stocks, together with federal bonds, created over $70 million in new financial instruments. These spurred the formation of securities markets, which allowed the federal government to borrow more money and underwrote the rapid spread of chartered banks and other private business corporations in the 1790s. For Federalists, this was one of the major purposes of the federal government. For opponents who wanted a more limited role for industry, however, or who lived on the frontier and lacked access to capital, Hamilton's system seemed to reinforce class boundaries and give the rich inordinate power over the federal government. Hamilton's plan, furthermore, had another highly controversial element. In order to pay what it owed on the new bonds, the federal government needed reliable sources of tax revenue. In 1791, Hamilton proposed a federal excise tax on the production, sale, and consumption of a number of goods, including whiskey.
Federal Judiciary Act 1789 *. One of the first acts of the new Congress was to establish a federal court system through the judiciary. Act signed by President Washington on September 24, 1789. The founders of the new nation believed that the establishment of a national judiciary was one of their most important tasks. Yet Article 3 of the Constitution of the United States, the provision that deals with the judiciary branch of government, is markedly smaller than Articles I and II, which created the legislative and executive branches. The generality of Article 3 of the Constitution raised questions that Congress had to address. In the Judiciary Act of 1789, these questions had no easy answers, and the solutions to them were achieved politically. The first Congress decided that it could regulate the jurisdiction of all federal courts, and in the Judiciary Act of 1789, Congress established with great particularity a limited jurisdiction for the district and circuit courts, gave the Supreme Court the original jurisdiction provided for in the Constitution, and granted the court appellate jurisdiction in cases from the federal circuit courts and from the state courts where those courts' rulings had rejected federal claims. The decision to grant federal courts a jurisdiction more restrictive than that allowed by the Constitution represented a recognition by the Congress that the people of the United States would not find a full-blown federal court system palatable at that time. For nearly all of the next century, the judicial system remained essentially as established by the Judiciary Act of 1789 only. After the country had expanded across a continent and had been torn apart by civil war were major changes made. A separate tier of appellate circuit courts created in 1891 removed the burden of circuit riding from the shoulders of the Supreme Court justices, but otherwise left intact the judicial structure. With minor adjustments, it is the same system we have today. Congress has continued to build on the interpretation of the drafters of the first Judiciary Act in exercising a discretionary power to expand or restrict federal court jurisdiction, while opinions as to what constitutes the proper balance of federal and state concerns vary no less today than they did 2 centuries ago. The fact that today's federal court system closely resembles the one created in 1789 suggests that the first Congress performed its job admirably. Hamilton's financial plan, 1790 to 1791. Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of Treasury, proposed federal assumption of state debts. Creation of a national Bank of the United States. Tariffs and excise taxes, notably the whiskey tax. Foreign policy challenges. French Revolution 1789, U.S. divided over supporting France versus Britain. Proclamation of Neutrality 1793. Washington kept the U.S. neutral in European wars. Jay's Treaty 1794. Improved trade with Britain but angered France. Pinckney's Treaty 1795 secured navigation rights on the Mississippi with Spain. Domestic challenges. Whiskey Rebellion 1794. Farmers in Pennsylvania protested whiskey tax. Washington personally led troops to suppress rebellion, showing federal power. Political parties form Federalists. Hamilton, Adams, strong central government, pro-British, favored merchants. Democratic Republicans, Jefferson, Madison, states' rights, pro-French, favored farmers. Meanwhile, during George Washington's presidency, political trouble was already brewing. Washington's cabinet choices reflected continuing tension between politicians who wanted and who feared a powerful national government. The vice president was John Adams, and Washington chose Alexander Hamilton to be his Secretary of the Treasury. Both men wanted an active government that would promote prosperity by supporting American industry. However, Washington chose Thomas Jefferson to be his Secretary of State, and Jefferson was committed to restricting federal power and preserving an economy based on agriculture. From almost the beginning, Washington struggled to reconcile the Federalist and Republican or Democratic Republican factions within his own administration. Alexander Hamilton believed that self-interest was the most powerful incentive of human actions. Self-interest drove humans to accumulate property, and that effort created commerce and industry. According to Hamilton, government had important roles to play in this process. First, the state should protect private property from theft. Second, according to Hamilton, the state should use human passions and make them subservient to the public good. In other words, a wise government would harness its citizens' desire for property so that both private individuals and the state would benefit. Hamilton, like many of his contemporary statesmen, did not believe the state should ensure an equal distribution of property. Inequality was the great and fundamental distinction in society, and Hamilton saw no reason to change this reality. Instead, Hamilton wanted to tie the economic interests of wealthy Americans, or moneyed men, to the federal government's financial health. If the rich needed the government, then they would direct their energies to making sure it remained solvent. Hamilton, therefore, believed that the federal government must be a repository of the rights of the wealthy. As the nation's first Secretary of the Treasury, he proposed an ambitious financial plan to achieve that. The first part of Hamilton's plan involved federal assumption of state debts, which were mostly left over from the Revolutionary War. The federal government would assume responsibility for the state's unpaid debts, which totaled about $25 million. Second, Hamilton wanted Congress to create a Bank of the United States. The goal of these proposals was to link federal power and the country's economic vitality. Under the assumption proposal, the state's creditors, people who owned state bonds or promissory notes, would turn their old notes into the Treasury and receive new federal notes of the same face value. Hamilton foresaw that these bonds would circulate like money, acting as an engine of business, an instrument of industry and commerce. This part of his plan, however, was controversial for two reasons. First, many taxpayers objected to paying the full face value on old notes, which had fallen in market value. Often the current holders had purchased them from the original creditors for pennies on the dollar. To pay them at full face value, therefore, would mean rewarding speculators at taxpayer expense. Hamilton countered that government debts must be honored in full, or else citizens would lose all trust in the government. Second, many Southerners objected that they had already paid their outstanding state debts, so federal assumption would mean forcing them to pay again for the debts of New Englanders. Nevertheless, President Washington and Congress both accepted Hamilton's argument. By the end of 1794, 98% of the country's domestic debt had been converted into new federal bonds, Hamilton's plan for a Bank of the United States. Similarly, won congressional approval despite strong opposition. Thomas Jefferson and other Republicans argued that the plan was unconstitutional. The Constitution did not authorize Congress to create a bank. Hamilton, however, argued that the bank was not only constitutional but also important for the country's prosperity. The Bank of the United States would fulfill several needs. It would act as a convenient depository for federal funds. It would print paper banknotes backed by specie gold or silver. Its agents would also help control inflation by periodically taking state banknotes to their banks of origin and demanding specie in exchange, limiting the amount of notes the state banks printed. Furthermore, it would give wealthy people a vested interest in the federal government's finances. The government would control just 20% of the bank's stock. The other 80% would be owned by private investors. Thus, an intimate connection between the government and wealthy men would benefit both. And this connection would promote American commerce. In 1791, therefore, Congress approved a 20-year charter for the Bank of the United States. The bank's stocks, together with federal bonds, created over $70 million in new financial instruments. These spurred the formation of securities markets, which allowed the federal government to borrow more money and underwrote the rapid spread of state-chartered banks and other private business corporations in the 1790s for Federalists. This was one of the major purposes of the federal government. For opponents who wanted a more limited role for industry, however, or who lived on the frontier and lacked access to capital, Hamilton's system seemed to reinforce class boundaries and give the rich inordinate power over the federal government. Hamilton's plan, furthermore, had another highly controversial element. In order to pay what it owed on the new bonds, the federal government needed reliable sources of tax revenue. In 1791, Hamilton proposed a federal excise tax on the production, sale, and consumption of a number of goods, including whiskey. Presidency of John Adams *. John Adams served as the second President of the United States from March 4, 1797, to March 4, 1801. Adams, who had served as Vice President under George Washington, took office as President after winning the 1796 presidential election. The only member of the Federalist Party to ever serve as president, his presidency ended after a single term following his defeat in the 1800 presidential election. He was succeeded by Thomas Jefferson of the opposition Democratic-Republican Party when Adams entered office. The ongoing major European war between France and Great Britain was causing great difficulties for American merchants on the high seas and arousing intense partisanship among contending political parties nationwide. Attempts to negotiate with the French led to the XYZ affair, in which French officials demanded bribes before they would assent to the beginning of negotiations. The XYZ affair outraged the American public, and the United States and France engaged in an undeclared naval conflict known as the Quasi-War, which dominated the remainder of Adams's presidency. Adams presided over an expansion of the Army and the Navy, and the Navy won several successes in the Quasi-War. The increased expenditures associated with these actions required greater federal revenue, and Congress passed the direct tax of 1798. The war and its associated taxation provoked domestic unrest, resulting in incidents such as Freese's Rebellion. In response to the unrest, both foreign and domestic, the Fifth Congress passed four bills, collectively known as the Alien and Sedition Acts, signed into law by the President. These acts made it more difficult for immigrants to become U.S. citizens, allowed the President to imprison and deport non-citizens who were deemed dangerous or who were from a hostile nation, and criminalized making false statements that were critical of the federal government. The Federalist majority argued that the bills strengthened national security during a time of conflict, while the Democratic Republicans harshly criticized the laws. Opposition to the Quasi-War and the Alien and the Sedition Acts, as well as the intra-party rivalry between Adams and Alexander Hamilton, all contributed to Adams's loss to Jefferson in the 1800 election. Historians have difficulty assessing Adams's presidency. Samuel Eliot Morison has written that he was by temperament unsuited for the presidency. He did no more than any other American, even James Madison, about political science. But as an administrator, he was uneasy. One nonetheless, Adams was able to avoid war with France, arguing that war should be a last resort to diplomacy. In this argument, he won the nation the respect of its most powerful adversaries. Although Adams was fiercely criticized for signing the Alien and Sedition Acts, he never advocated their passage nor personally implemented them, and he pardoned the instigators of Freese's Rebellion. Seen in this light, observed historian C. James Taylor, Adams's legacy is one of reason, moral leadership, the rule of law, compassion, and a cautious but active foreign policy that aimed both at securing the national interest and achieving an honorable peace. Election of 1796. The election of 1796 was the first contested American presidential election. George Washington had been elected to office unanimously in the first two presidential elections. However, during his presidency, deep philosophical differences manifested between the two leading figures in the administration, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Their competing visions of domestic and foreign policy caused a rift within the administration and led to the founding of the Federalist Party and the Democratic-Republican Party. Washington's announcement that he would not be a candidate for a third term ignited an intense partisan struggle over the presidency. Like the previous two presidential elections, no candidates were put directly before the voters in 1796. The Constitution instead provided that each state selected presidential electors, and a vote of the presidential electors selected the president. As the election took place before the ratification of the 12th Amendment, each presidential elector cast 2 votes for president, though electors were not allowed to cast both votes for the same person. The Constitution prescribed that the person receiving the most votes would become president, provided that they won votes from a majority of the electors, while the person with the second most electoral votes would become vice president. Voters chose the presidential electors in 7 states. In the remaining 9 states, they were chosen by the state's legislature. Adams and Hamilton both wanted to lead the Federalist Party, but Vice President Adams was widely viewed as Washington's heir apparent, and he consolidated support among his party's electors. The clear favorite of Democratic Republicans was Thomas Jefferson. Though he was reluctant to run, the Democratic Republicans in Congress held a nominating caucus and named Jefferson and Aaron Burr as their presidential choices. Jefferson at first declined the nomination, but he finally agreed to run a few weeks later. Federalist members of Congress held an informal nominating caucus and named Adams and Thomas Pinckney as their presidential candidates. The campaign was, for the most part, unorganized and sporadic. Confined to newspaper attacks, pamphlets, and political rallies, Federalists attacked Jefferson as a Francophile and an atheist. while the Democratic Republicans accused Adams of being an Anglophile and a monarchist. In early November, France's ambassador to the United States, Pierre Audet, inserted himself into the political debate on behalf of Jefferson, publishing statements designed to arouse anti-British sentiment and to leave the impression that a Jefferson victory would result in improved relations with France. Meanwhile, Hamilton, desiring a more pliant president than Adams, maneuvered to tip the election to Pinckney. He coerced South Carolina Federalist electors, who had pledged to vote for favorite son Pinckney, to scatter their second votes among candidates other than Adams. Hamilton's scheme was undone, however, when several New England state electors heard of it, conferred, and agreed not to vote for Pinckney. The votes of the 138 members of the Electoral College were counted during a joint session of Congress on February 8, 1797. The top three vote recipients were Adams 71 votes, Jefferson 69, and Pinckney 59. The balance of the votes were dispersed among Burr and 9 other candidates. Almost all of Adams's votes came from Northern electors, and almost all of Jefferson's votes came from Southern electors. As President of the Senate, it fell to Adams to announce himself as President-elect and his chief opponent, Jefferson, as Vice President-elect. A week later, he delivered an emotional farewell speech to the body whose deliberations he had presided over for 8 years. The American two-party system came into being during the run-up to the 1796 election, the only election to date in which a president and vice president were elected from opposing parties. The rivalry between New England and the South, with the Middle States holding the balance of power, began to germinate at this time as well. Thomas Jefferson's presidency 1801 to 1809 saw the dramatic expansion of the United States through the Louisiana Purchase, the organization of the Lewis and Clark expedition, and conflict with Barbary pirates. He also implemented a policy of neutrality in foreign affairs, which culminated in the Embargo Act of 1807. Though his administration also faced criticism for constitutional overreach and failed attempts to eliminate national debt. The presidency of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson served as the third president of the United States from 1801 until 1809. His presidency was among the most influential in U.S. history. Jefferson doubled the size of the nation with the Louisiana Purchase and organized the Lewis and Clark expedition to explore the new territory and chart a route to the Pacific Ocean. He dramatically changed the institution of the presidency itself, adopting practices that helped define the role and using his platform to promote cherished values like the separation of church and state. He also became the first president to use military power to protect American interests overseas. Jefferson came to office vowing to cut the size and cost of the federal government, and while he did cut the national debt dramatically over his 2 terms, he was unable to fulfill his goal to eliminate it completely. This, combined with his broad assertions of presidential power in the purchase of the Louisiana Territory and the Barbary War, led, then and now, to claims of hypocrisy in a man who touted limited constitutional powers. However, Jefferson's thoughtful reconsideration of the hyperpartisanship in which he and his supporters had participated in the 1790s, added to the weight of actually governing, explains in part his moderation on a number of issues. Jefferson's presidency was also marked by the moral challenges of slavery, which continued to spread throughout his terms. His efforts to keep the United States out of a European war through economic coercion and embargo on exports was deeply unpopular and economically disastrous and collapsed as his term ended. Yet his vision of limited government has resonated since his presidency, and historians continue to rank Jefferson in the top tier of American presidents. The Revolution of 1800. Jefferson was inaugurated as the third president of the United States on March 4, 1801. Following the deeply partisan and particularly vicious election of 1800 and the first peaceful transfer of power among contending political parties in modern times, he termed his election the Revolution of 1800. and said that it was as real a revolution in the principles of our government as was the Revolution of 1776. Key to this promised revolution was empowering citizens to more effectively control their government, shrinking the size and cost of the federal government, and hewing closely to the limited powers he believed were conferred by the U.S. Constitution, as in 1776 the possibilities seemed endless. Reality would prove more difficult. Jefferson's first inaugural address, a deeply personal statement, is best remembered for the famous line, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists," after the hyperpartisanship of the 1790s. The Federalists' Alien and Sedition Acts that led Jefferson to term the era a reign of witches, open threats of secession, and the Electoral College tie between Jefferson and his erstwhile vice presidential candidate, Aaron Burr, that almost deadlocked the electoral apparatus. His address focused on critical, shared American principles. He made clear that he was the president of all Americans. He expressed understanding for his former political opponents, and he reminded Americans that what united them was more important than what divided them. U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall caught the conciliatory spirit of the address, writing to Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, the defeated Federalist candidate for vice president, that it gave the lie to the violent party declamation which has elected him. The address was reprinted in English, French, Italian, and German. Central to all of President Jefferson's efforts was the exceptional cabinet he selected and with whom he worked closely: James Madison as Secretary of State, Albert Gallatin as Secretary of Treasury, Levi Lincoln and later John Breckinridge and Caesar Rodney as Attorney General, Henry Dearborn as Secretary of War, and Robert Smith as Secretary of the Navy. Dispute with the judiciary. Among the most difficult policy disputes faced by Jefferson was the proper role for the judicial branch and its relation to the executive and legislative branches. After the results of the election of 1800 became known, the lame duck Federalist Congress and President John Adams sought to limit the impact of the Democratic-Republican victory by ensuring Federalist control of a larger and more powerful judiciary. The Judiciary Act of 1801, adopted on February 13 for days before Jefferson's Electoral College victory, expanded federal court jurisdiction, created 16 new circuit court judges, and eliminated the necessity of Supreme Court justices riding circuit through the states to hear appeals with local district court judges. Jefferson viewed the new circuit courts as an unnecessary expansion of federal power and the midnight judges appointed by the lame duck Adams as an unwarranted attack on his newly elected government. Over desultory constitutional objections, he supported legislation eliminating the circuit courts and restoring the riding circuit for Supreme Court justices. With the circuit courts abolished, Jefferson was effectively able to fire the 16 new Federalist judges who would otherwise have been beyond his control. The Judiciary Act of 1801 also created a group of local Washington, D.C. magistrates. Among those named to the new position was William Marbury, but his commission, while signed before Jefferson was inaugurated, had not been delivered. When Jefferson took the position that a commission was not valid until delivered and ordered Secretary of State James Madison to withhold it, Marbury sued in the Supreme Court seeking to force Madison to deliver his commission. In the 1803 decision Marbury v. Madison, the Supreme Court under Chief Justice John Marshall decided that, while Marbury's commission was valid, it had no jurisdiction over the dispute because the law granting it that authority was itself unconstitutional. While technically a victory for Jefferson, the case, which has been called the most consequential in the history of the Supreme Court, confirmed the principle of judicial review, the power of the Supreme Court to declare unconstitutional an act passed by Congress and signed by the President. An important addition to the system of checks and balances, Jefferson also sought to address what he viewed as abuses of judicial authority. Most notably, Federalist Supreme Court Justice Samuel Chase had been accused of injecting politics into judicial proceedings in several cases. He had aggressively enforced the Sedition Act and harangued grand juries. attorneys, and witnesses from the bench. And after the repeal of the Judiciary Act of 1801, he openly attacked the action during a grand jury proceeding. In response, Democratic-Republican firebrand Congressman John Randolph of Virginia, then a close ally of Jefferson's, led an impeachment proceeding against Chase in the House of Representatives. Chase was impeached on March 12, 1804. 4. Among other things, refusing to dismiss biased jurors and limiting defense witnesses based on politics. However, after a month-long trial, the Senate failed to convict Chase with the requisite two-thirds vote, further cementing the independence of the federal judiciary. Jefferson concluded that impeachment was inadequate to address judicial abuses. Later referring to it as not even a scarecrow, the Danbury Baptist letter as author of the groundbreaking Virginia statute for establishing religious freedom. Jefferson was widely known as an advocate of religious liberty. Given his reputation, sometime shortly after October 7, 1801, the Danbury Baptist Association of Connecticut wrote to him complaining about the lack of protection for the religious freedom of minority religions in Connecticut, where the established church was the Congregational Church. What religious privileges we enjoy. We enjoy as favors granted, they wrote. Both Jefferson and the Baptists understood that he had no authority to alter state-imposed restrictions. The First Amendment of the Constitution prohibiting government establishment of religion did not then apply to the states. Still, Jefferson saw that the letter posed an opportunity of sowing useful truths and principles among the people. In a reply to the Baptists, he took the opportunity to declare that the First Amendment created a wall of separation between church and state. Jefferson's letter was widely circulated, with excerpts appearing in more than 24 newspapers around the country within weeks. As Jefferson had hoped, the principles he articulated resonated long afterward. In its first decision concerning the scope of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, Reynolds v. United States, the Supreme Court unanimously declared in 1879 that Jefferson's letter may be accepted almost as an authoritative declaration of the scope and effect of the amendment. The Danbury Baptist letter is an excellent example of how Jefferson used the presidency as what President Theodore Roosevelt later termed a bully pulpit, using the office to speak broadly to the American people about important principles. Leading the nation in this manner was a hallmark of Jefferson's presidency. The Barbary War *, early American seamen often found themselves in conflict with a group of Barbary states in North Africa, Tripoli, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco that sought to control passage through the Mediterranean Sea and parts of the eastern Atlantic. Major European powers paid these nations regular bribes known as tribute to permit passage of their ships, concluding that it was cheaper than going to war to secure passage. American ships benefited from British protection until the Revolutionary War. Afterwards, the United States, too, had generally paid bribes. In 1801, unhappy with the tribute he had been paid, the ruler of Tripoli, Yusuf Karamanli, began to seize U.S. merchantmen, requiring a ransom for their release and effectively declaring war. Since his term as minister to France in the 1780s, Jefferson had argued that paying tribute was dishonorable and inefficient. It would be better to fight to end what he saw as legalized piracy. With Tripoli's declaration of war, President Jefferson decided to fight, a decision complicated by the fact that he also sought to cut the size of the small U.S. Navy as part of his effort to economize. From 1801 to 1805, Jefferson sent frigates to the Mediterranean to protect American ships and, later, to blockade and bombard Tripoli. Lacking a congressional declaration of war, Jefferson maintained that U.S. efforts against Tripoli were purely defensive. Unfortunately, in 1803, the frigate Philadelphia ran aground in Tripoli's harbor, and its 300 men were taken captive. In response, the Navy tightened its blockade, and William Eaton, formerly consul to Tunis and now U.S. naval agent, directed a small group of mercenaries and Tripolitans, nominally led by Karamanli's older brother, Hammett, to attack Tripoli from the east. While U.S. naval bombardment caused considerable damage, fear that his regime was endangered by the approach of his brother led Karamanli to negotiate a peace treaty. While the United States refused to offer tribute, it did agree to pay $60,000 as ransom for the 300 sailors who had been held for 19 months, and returned almost 100 Tripolitans captured during the American blockade, while a short conflict with Morocco erupted in the midst of the war. Generally, peace was maintained with the other powers, and the United States was relieved of paying tribute. It was ironic that Jefferson, who campaigned on cutting the military and was skeptical of the value of a large navy, launched a foreign war. But the war proved popular, as Americans apparently trusted Jefferson to do what was necessary in this first instance of using military power to protect U.S. interests abroad, the merry affair in the 1790s. Democratic Republicans had criticized the administrations of both George Washington and John Adams for mimicking British monarchical practices, from formal levees to bowing when greeting the president. Jefferson believed that such practices could undermine a clear understanding that, in a republic, all citizens were equal before the law. Jefferson did not include women or African Americans among those to whom equal rights were owed. As president, Jefferson took the opportunity to embrace publicly a far more plebeian style, even when his actions sometimes offended European or political sensibilities, as was the case with what became known as the Merry Affair. In November 1803, when Britain's new diplomatic minister, Anthony Merry, came to present his credentials to Jefferson in full diplomatic regalia, complete with a plumed hat and dress sword. He was appalled to be received by the president in informal dress, including a pair of slippers. Jefferson multiplied the insult in the eyes of the new diplomat and his wife, Elizabeth Mary, when they were invited to a dinner at the president's house and were seated pell-mell with no attention paid to rank rather than the minister's wife being escorted first into the dining room by the president as protocol dictated. An angry communique to Britain followed, insisting that not only had Mary been insulted, but, by extension, so had King George. Similar breaches of formal protocol annoyed the Spanish minister, Marquis de Casa Urullo, and his wife, Sarah McKean Urullo, the daughter of the governor of Pennsylvania. Jefferson was not trying to be rude. Rather, he was making a point about the lack of formal titles and pomp in America. He had made the same point when he decided to walk to his inauguration and when, each year on January 1st, he opened the president's house for a reception that welcomed not only members of Congress and the diplomatic corps but also scores of ordinary citizens. The Louisiana Purchases. The 19th century began. Spain controlled New Orleans and had on occasion shut the Mississippi River to American trade. Doing so again in October 1802, this threatened the livelihood of hundreds of thousands of Americans living west of the Appalachian Mountains. Jefferson recognized the threat, telling Robert R. Livingston, the U.S. minister to France, "There is on the globe one single spot, the possessor of which is our natural and habitual enemy. It is New Orleans, through which the produce of 3/8 of our territory must pass to market." In 1803. After Napoleon Bonaparte gained control of the Louisiana Territory that encompassed New Orleans, Jefferson asked James Monroe to join Livingston in France to try to purchase the city. Much to the diplomat's surprise, Napoleon, desperate for funds to support his European wars and having suffered devastating losses in his effort to recapture Saint-Domingue from previously enslaved rebels, offered to sell the entire Louisiana Territory to the United States. A price of $15 million for the 827,000 square miles was agreed, and a draft treaty was sent to Washington. By doubling the size of the young nation, Jefferson saw the Louisiana Purchase as an opportunity to expand dramatically what he called America's Empire of Liberty, but the U.S. Constitution did not expressly provide authority to enlarge U.S. territory, and Jefferson initially believed that a constitutional amendment was needed. When members of his cabinet objected that a delay could undermine the deal, Jefferson acquiesced and sent the treaty to the Senate for ratification. While he thought the executive branch had done an act beyond the Constitution, he urged Congress to approve it. Unrestrained by metaphysical subtleties, the American people's approval would be sought in the 1804 election, he told Senator John Breckinridge. For doing for them unauthorized what we know they would have done for themselves had they been in a situation to do it. For Jefferson, the Louisiana Purchase was not just a great land deal in which the country acquired millions of acres for about 3 cents an acre. It also guaranteed that Americans would have land available for generations. Like many of his contemporaries, Jefferson believed that American Indians who occupied Western lands should assimilate. Move west or face extermination, millions of yeoman farmers would drive the frontier west, cultivating and building and, from Jefferson's perspective, improving the land. He hoped that such farmers, independent and not beholden to an industrial employer, would be a voice for political independence. The result was that the United States retained its agrarian majority throughout the 19th century, and the mythology of the frontier farmer continues to play an outsized role in the American image. Doubling the physical territory of the United States became one of Jefferson's most important legacies. The Louisiana Purchase made Jefferson hugely popular. Alexander Hamilton, the only Federalist who might have seriously challenged Jefferson's purchase, had been killed by Vice President Aaron Burr in a duel on July 11, 1804. Jefferson won re-election in 1804 in a landslide of 162 to 14 electoral votes, even carrying most states in the Federalist stronghold of New England. Lewis and Clark Expedition * even before the Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson was planning an expedition to explore the West beyond the Mississippi River for scientific and strategic reasons, to open trade with native tribes, and for commercial development, especially finding the most practicable route to the Pacific Ocean. With the Louisiana Territory secured, Jefferson provided detailed instructions to the Corps of Discovery led by his personal secretary, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, a former Army officer. The Lewis and Clark expedition began to ascend the Missouri River in mid-May 1804. As many as 45 people accompanied the expedition on parts of its journey, including Clark's enslaved man, York, a Shoshone woman, Sacagawea, her husband, French guide Toussaint Charbonneau, and their infant son, Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau. Descending the Columbia River, the expedition sighted the Pacific Ocean on November 7, 1805. They triumphantly returned to St. Louis on September 23, 1806. Having traveled almost 8,000 miles and charted a host of western rivers, communicated with over 40 native tribes, gathered ethnographic information, and discovered numerous plant and animal species, Jefferson supported other exploratory endeavors, including Zebulon Montgomery Pike's expedition to the Southwest, noted for the discovery of Pike's Peak. These efforts served multiple purposes for Jefferson: expanding the American Empire of Liberty, scientific discovery, creating commercial opportunities, and developing relations with the indigenous people in territory claimed by the United States. Jefferson and American Indian special contact with indigenous peoples was one of the key objectives of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Jefferson hoped to encourage future trade with native tribes to pave the way for other commercial traffic, including the fur trade, and to assert U.S. sovereignty by ending native cooperation with Britain and Spain. Jefferson also had a long-term interest in collecting ethnographic data on America's native people, and Lewis and Clark gathered a wealth of information in that regard. As a result of Lewis and Clark's expedition, over 40 native tribes were contacted, and a number of indigenous leaders were encouraged to visit President Jefferson in Washington. While Jefferson said that he hoped to live in perpetual peace with the indigenous tribes, he believed that native people should adopt American farming practices, spinning and weaving, and assimilate into U.S. culture, unlike his well-known view that after emancipation, free African Americans should be colonized elsewhere. Such assimilation would also mean that native people, having given up hunting and a semi-nomadic lifestyle, could sell unneeded land to the United States, which was another of his major goals. In fact, Jefferson advised the governor of the Indiana Territory, William Henry Harrison, to run indigenous people in debt to encourage the sale of land, if they did not assimilate. Incorporating with us as citizens of the U.S., then, Jefferson believed that they should remove beyond the Mississippi. The alternative was extermination. While Jefferson's Indian policy in many ways mirrored that of other American leaders, as president he was aggressive in land acquisitions. During his tenure, U.S. officials negotiated more than 30 treaties with native tribes that surrendered millions of acres to the United States, especially in the Old Northwest Territory. Realizing the implications of Jefferson's policies, several native movements sought to resist, including Tecumseh's Pan-Indian movement in the Old Northwest Territories and the Creek Red Sticks in the Southwest. These efforts would result in armed conflict and, ultimately, the loss of additional native lands in the years following Jefferson's presidency. Slavery and hated Jefferson's legacy is wrapped up in the issue of slavery. The man who wrote that all men are created equal owned more than 600 humans, including some of his own children. Yet slavery did not take the prominent role in his presidency that it took during the later antebellum period as sectional hostilities took hold, furthered in part by the new territory added by the Louisiana Purchase and the expansion of slavery. In the growing nation, Jefferson did support legislation in 1807. That banned the international slave trade effective January 1, 1808, the first day permitted under the U.S. Constitution. However, this created a booming domestic slave trade that particularly benefited enslavers in Upper South states like Virginia, who had an excess of enslaved labor for their agricultural needs and found a ready market in newly expanding territories. Jefferson also undermined diplomatic relations with the former French colony of Saint-Domingue, today's Haiti, in the aftermath of the slave rebellion there led by Toussaint Louverture that began in 1791. Both the Washington and Adams administrations encouraged trade with the formerly enslaved inhabitants of Saint-Domingue, and President Adams sent a consul to engage with Louverture and his followers. In 1806, however, Jefferson supported a ban on trade with Haiti, ostensibly to assuage France. But, like other enslavers, he clearly feared the influence of a successful slave revolt so close to the U.S. South in 1802. He wrote to Rufus King, U.S. Minister in London, noting that the course of things in the neighboring islands of the West Indies appears to have given a considerable impulse to the minds of slaves. A great disposition to insurgency has manifested itself among them. He referenced a recently foiled uprising in Virginia by a participant in Gabriel's conspiracy, which also had been linked to the Haitian Revolt. The national debt and fiscal integrity, central pillar of Jefferson's campaign for the presidency, was a commitment to reduce the size and cost of the federal government. His Treasury Secretary, Albert Gallatin, helped him to deliver on that promise. When Jefferson took office, the national debt stood at $83 million. Jefferson and Gallatin crafted a plan to eliminate the national debt and internal taxes within 16 years. With the expenses of the Louisiana Purchase and the Barbary War, Jefferson was unable to fully implement the plan. Nonetheless, he did cut operating expenditures, slashing the budget for the Army and Navy, and with rapidly expanding import duties successfully eliminated internal taxes, including the highly unpopular tax on whiskey. He significantly reduced the national debt, cutting it to $57 million in 1809. All of these actions fed Jefferson's reputation for fiscal restraint. The embargo of 1807. Jefferson's most vexing problem involved the continuing wars in Europe precipitated by the French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, with Britain and France locked in almost constant warfare from 1792 until the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. Each sought to obtain food and supplies from the United States while denying them to their enemy. The result was a flurry of confusing British and French edicts permitting the seizure of U.S. ships trading with the enemy and, in the case of Britain, the seizure or impressment of seamen on U.S. merchant ships whom a British officer, often arbitrarily, identified as British deserters. These conflicts came to a head in 1807, as British warships patrolled the coast of Virginia, hoping to capture French ships trading with the United States or U.S. merchant ships with British deserters on board. On June 22, the British ship HMS Leopard sought to board the American frigate USS Chesapeake, which was reported to be carrying several British deserters, shortly after it left Norfolk. The American captain, not expecting conflict, was caught off guard when his refusal to come to for the British ship was met with 3 broadsides. Unprepared for battle, the Chesapeake quickly surrendered, but not before 3 U.S. seamen were killed and 18 wounded. The British seized for suspected deserters, 3 of whom turned out to be American citizens. The Chesapeake affair inflamed public opinion. Never since the Battle of Lexington have I seen this country in such a state of exasperation as at present, Jefferson wrote to Pierre Samuel Dupont de Nemours. Britain did pay some reparations, but calls for military reprisal continued. Hoping to avoid open warfare and lacking the navy to counter Britain, Jefferson charted an economic strategy. He initially supported a partial non-importation agreement, but by December 1807 had settled on an embargo of all U.S. exports, both to protect U.S. ships and seamen and, of course, a more reasonable policy from Britain and France. The embargo was deeply unpopular and roundly criticized domestically, especially in New England, and blatantly evaded. Ultimately, it proved ineffective at changing British or French policies but cost many U.S. merchants and farmers dearly. It did have the unintended consequence of fostering textile and other manufacturing in New England, which helped jumpstart the Industrial Revolution and encouraged manufacturing jobs rather than the yeoman farmers whom Jefferson preferred. While Jefferson believed the embargo could have been effective if it had continued for a longer period or had been more fully enforced, it was repealed on March 15, 1809, shortly after President James Madison was inaugurated. The underlying problems of impressment and shipping blockades would fester until the War of 1812. Legacy by December 1807, Jefferson made it clear that, following the tradition established by George Washington, he would serve only to terms. Given Jefferson's popularity, it was anticipated that a member of his party would easily be elected, but there was some question as to whom that would be. Jefferson clearly hoped that Madison, his Secretary of State and longtime friend, would be elected, but he avoided publicly interfering in the decision so as not to encourage intra-party strife. Some Democratic Republicans, led by John Randolph, sought to promote Monroe for the position. In the end, Madison easily won the nomination of the party caucus and a resounding Electoral College victory of 122-247 by and large. Madison continued Jefferson's policies. Notably, he retained Gallatin as Secretary of the Treasury and made his ostensible rival Monroe his Secretary of State. For his part, Jefferson left Washington pleased to be relieved of the distressing burden of power from his historic assertion of the importance of the separation of church and state, to forcing a clarification of the powers of the Supreme Court, to his insistence that the president was, first and foremost, a citizen among co-citizens. Jefferson's impact on the presidency and still developing American democracy is hard to overstate, and despite his ambitions to preside over a smaller, less intrusive government, he was a strong president who exercised executive authority broadly if not aggressively, as demonstrated by the Louisiana Purchase and the Barbary War. Although this led to claims of hypocrisy, it seems fair to conclude that after the negative reaction to the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, which were passed by the Kentucky and Virginia legislatures threatening the non-enforcement of what they perceived as the unconstitutional Alien and Sedition Acts, and the heated campaign of 1800, Jefferson abandoned the more radical aspects of his partisan agenda of the 1790s, faced with the reality of governing a large and rapidly growing nation. Jefferson sought pragmatic solutions to problems, even when that meant using a strong federal hand. Jefferson was also the first chief executive to effectively lead a political party as president. In doing so, he was enormously successful. For example, he never had to exercise his presidential veto as Congress usually conformed to his intended programs. Significantly, for 24 of the 28 years after Jefferson left the presidency, avowed Jeffersonians held the office of president, a record not met since.